The citation taped to my greenhouse door fluttered in the morning breeze, and I felt my stomach drop as I read the words "violation of community aesthetic standards" in bold red letters. I had been living in Greenbrier Commons in Charleston, South Carolina for 3 years, and this was the first time the HOA had bothered me about anything. My name is Robert Vance, and I work as a botanical garden consultant specializing in rare and endangered plant species. My property wasn't just a hobby garden. It was a crucial conservation effort housing specimens that existed nowhere else in the southeastern United States. I pulled the notice off the door and scanned through the details. The fine was $250, with an additional $100 per week if I didn't remedy the situation within 14 days. The complaint cited excessive vegetation, unsightly greenhouse structures, and deviation from approved landscaping plans. I felt heat rising in my chest. Every single plant on my property served a purpose, and the greenhouse was specifically positioned to be minimally visible from the street. Walking back to my house, I examined my yard with fresh eyes. Sure, it was densely planted compared to my neighbors' sterile lawns, but everything was meticulously maintained. The front yard featured native South Carolina plants that required minimal water and provided habitat for local pollinators. The sides of the house held my more delicate specimens in raised beds with careful climate control. The greenhouse in the back was barely visible unless you were standing directly in my driveway. I had just returned from a consultation in Atlanta, where I had helped design a conservation wing for a major botanical garden. My work involved tracking down rare cultivars, propagating endangered species, and advising institutions on proper care protocols. The specimens in my yard included several plants that were extinct in the wild and existed only in controlled environments like mine. The Franklinia alatamaha trees alone were worth more than most people's cars, not in monetary terms but in biological significance. The notice listed the complainant as Brenda Whitmore, president of the Greenbrier Commons Homeowners Association. I had met Brenda exactly twice. Once at a mandatory HOA meeting when I first moved in, and once when she stopped by to welcome me with a basket of store-bought muffins and a packet of community guidelines. She had seemed pleasant enough then, if a bit overly concerned with property values and curb appeal. I called my colleague Marcus at the Charleston Botanical Society to vent. He listened patiently as I ranted about the absurdity of being fined for conservation work. "Robert, you need to document everything," Marcus said. "Get photos, get your credentials together, get letters from every organization you work with. HOAs can be unreasonable, but they also have to follow their own bylaws. Check what your CC and Articus actually say about landscaping." That was solid advice. I spent the rest of the morning photographing every section of my property and compiling a portfolio of my work. My resume included positions with the Missouri Botanical Garden, consulting work for the Atlanta Botanical Garden, and active research projects with 3 universities. I had published papers on conservation horticulture and spoken at international conferences. The idea that my carefully curated collection constituted a violation of community standards was laughable. I pulled out the thick binder of HOA documents I had received when I purchased the house. Most homeowners never read these things thoroughly, and I was guilty of the same. I had skimmed them, noted the basic rules about no commercial vehicles and no permanent recreational vehicles, and filed it away. Now, I read every page carefully. The landscaping section was frustratingly vague. It mentioned maintaining a neat appearance, keeping grass cut to a reasonable height, and ensuring that any structures were aesthetically appropriate. There was a clause about seeking architectural approval for any buildings, which I had done for my greenhouse. I dug through my files until I found the approval letter from 3 years ago. The Architectural Review Committee, which Brenda chaired, had approved the greenhouse with the stipulation that it be positioned behind the house and painted in earth tones. I had followed both requirements exactly. Armed with this information, I drafted a formal response to the HOA. I explained my profession, detailed the conservation importance of my work, provided documentation of the greenhouse approval, and requested a hearing before the board to discuss the matter. I kept my tone professional but firm. This fine was not just unjust, it was potentially damaging to important conservation efforts. 2 days later, I received a phone call from Brenda herself. Her voice had a saccharine quality that immediately put me on guard. "Mr. Vance, I received your response to our citation. I appreciate your passion for plants, but you need to understand that we have community standards to maintain. Several neighbors have complained about the appearance of your property." "Which neighbors?" I asked. "And what specifically about my property violates the bylaws?" "I've reviewed them carefully, and everything I have is within the stated guidelines." "Well, the bylaws give the board discretion to determine what constitutes excessive or unsightly landscaping. Your property looks more like a jungle than a residential home. We have standards here in Greenbrier Commons. I'd like to speak to the board directly. When is your next meeting?" There was a pause. "The next regular meeting isn't until the 3rd Thursday of next month. That's well past your compliance deadline." "Then I'd like to request an emergency hearing. The bylaws allow for that in cases of disputed violations." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear her teeth grinding. "I'll discuss it with the other board members and get back to you." She hung up without saying goodbye. I sat back in my chair, staring at my phone. Something about this felt personal, though I couldn't imagine why. I barely knew Brenda and had never had any conflicts with neighbors. I kept to myself, maintained my property, and the only traffic my work generated was the occasional delivery of supplies or visit from fellow botanists. The next morning, I decided to do some reconnaissance. I walked through the neighborhood, really looking at other properties for the first time. Greenbrier Commons was a medium-sized development of about 60 homes, built in the early 2000s with that generic suburban aesthetic that could be anywhere in America. Most yards were indeed very simple. Grass, a few foundation shrubs, maybe a dogwood or crepe myrtle tree. But nothing in the bylaws required this uniformity. I stopped to chat with my next-door neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Russo, who I occasionally helped with his gardening. Frank was watering his azaleas when I walked up. "Morning, Frank. Can I ask you something?" "Have you ever heard complaints about my property?" Frank turned off his hose and wiped his forehead. "Your place. Not from me. I love walking past your yard. Always something interesting to see. My wife keeps asking what that tree is with the white flowers." "That's one of my Franklinia trees. They're actually extinct in the wild." "No kidding. That's something special." He paused, looking uncomfortable. "Though I did hear Brenda talking about your place at the pool last week. She was going on about property values and setting a precedent. Seemed pretty worked up about it." "Did she say why?" Frank shrugged. "You know how Brenda is. She likes everything just so. Her own yard looks like it came out of a catalog, not a leaf out of place." I thanked Frank and continued my walk, eventually looping around to Brenda Street. Her house was at the end of a cul-de-sac, a large 2-story colonial with white columns. Frank was right about the yard. It was immaculate in that sterile way that required either a lot of time or a lot of money spent on lawn services. The grass was uniformly green and cut in perfect diagonal stripes. The shrubs were trimmed into rigid geometric shapes. A line of bright red begonias bordered the walkway, each plant exactly the same size. Standing there looking at Brenda's property, I understood the disconnect. She saw landscaping as decoration, as something to be controlled and regimented. My approach was fundamentally different. I worked with plants as living beings, each with specific needs and natural growth patterns. Beauty came from health and diversity, not from forcing nature into unnatural forms. A car pulled into Brenda's driveway, and I realized I was standing on the sidewalk staring at her house like some kind of stalker. I quickly continued walking, but not before I saw her get out of a white SUV and glare at me. Great. That probably did not help my case. That afternoon, I received an email from the HOA. The board had agreed to an emergency hearing, scheduled for the following Tuesday at 7 in the evening at the community clubhouse. I had 5 days to prepare my presentation. I spent those days building a comprehensive defense. I created a PowerPoint presentation detailing my work, the significance of the species in my collection, and the conservation organizations I worked with. I compiled letters of support from the Charleston Botanical Society, 2 university biology departments, and the North American Plant Conservation Consortium. I printed photos showing my property from various angles, demonstrating that, from the street, it looked like an attractively landscaped yard, just more diverse than the typical suburban lawn. My colleague Marcus agreed to attend as an expert witness. He brought along Sarah Chen, a plant ecologist from the College of Charleston who specialized in conservation biology. Having professional support felt crucial. Tuesday evening arrived, and I drove to the clubhouse with a folder full of documents and a laptop with my presentation. The community clubhouse was a small building near the neighborhood pool, with a main room that could hold maybe 50 people. When I arrived at 6:45, Brenda was already there, arranging papers at a table in the front. 4 other people sat at the table with her, the other board members I assumed. A surprising number of residents had shown up. I counted about 20 people in the folding chairs arranged in rows. Some faces I recognized from around the neighborhood, others were strangers. Marcus and Sarah arrived a few minutes later and sat in the front row. At precisely 7, Brenda called the meeting to order. She introduced herself as HOA president and introduced the other board members: Thomas Wright, vice president; Jennifer Lawson, treasurer; Keith Morgan, secretary; and Patricia Dunn, member at large. They all looked to be in their 50s or 60s, well dressed in that country club casual style. "We're here tonight to address the violation notice issued to Mr. Robert Vance of 847 Maple Ridge Drive," Brenda began. "Mr. Vance has requested a hearing to dispute the fine. Mr. Vance, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood and walked to the front, connecting my laptop to the projector. My first slide showed my name and credentials. I spoke clearly and calmly, explaining my background in botanical conservation and the nature of my work. I showed images of some of the rare species I was growing, explaining their conservation status and why they required specialized care. The Franklinia alatamaha, for example, hasn't been seen in the wild since the early 1800s. Every specimen alive today is descended from seeds collected by botanist John Bartlett. I have 3 trees, grown from cuttings provided by the Atlanta Botanical Garden as part of a distribution program to ensure the species survives. I showed more examples. A rare orchid species native to South Carolina swamps that was down to a single known wild population. A native azalea cultivar that had nearly been lost to development. Each plant had a story, each had a purpose beyond mere decoration. My property is not random or excessive, I continued. Every plant has been chosen deliberately, placed according to its specific light, water, and soil requirements. The overall effect may be more lush than typical suburban landscaping, but it is meticulously maintained and serves a vital conservation purpose. I then displayed the greenhouse approval letter from 3 years ago, highlighting that I had followed proper procedures and received written permission for the structure. Finally, I've reviewed the CC and Articas thoroughly. The landscaping provisions are designed to prevent genuine problems. Overgrown yards that attract pests, dead or dying plants that look neglected, permanent storage of unsightly materials. None of these apply to my property. My yard is healthy, well-maintained, and biodiverse. It follows the letter and spirit of our community guidelines. I finished by introducing Marcus and Sarah, who each spoke briefly about the importance of private conservation efforts and the scientific value of my collection. Marcus emphasized that botanical gardens alone couldn't preserve every species that needed protection, and that networks of private growers like myself played a crucial role in conservation strategies. When we finished, Brenda's expression was stony. Thomas Wright, the vice president, raised his hand. "This is all very interesting, Mr. Vance, but at the end of the day, this is a residential community. We're not a botanical garden. Don't you think this kind of work is better suited to a rural property or a commercial facility?" With respect, Mr. Wright, nothing in our bylaws restricts the type of plants homeowners can grow as long as the property is maintained. Would you fine someone for growing too many roses or too many vegetables? The distinction is arbitrary. Jennifer Lawson, the treasurer, spoke up. "I've driven past your property, Mr. Vance. It is very dense compared to other homes. Don't you think there's something to be said for community cohesion, for homes that fit in with their surroundings?" "I think there's something to be said for diversity," I replied. "Both botanical and aesthetic. Monoculture lawns are actually terrible for local ecosystems. They require excessive water, fertilizer, and pesticides. They provide no habitat for native insects or birds. My yard supports dozens of native species and requires far fewer chemical inputs than a traditional lawn." Brenda finally spoke. "We're not here to debate the merits of different landscaping philosophies. The fact is, we've received multiple complaints about your property. Residents have expressed concern about how it affects property values. Our job as a board is to protect the interests of all homeowners." "Who complained?" I asked. "I'd like to hear specific concerns from specific people." Brenda's jaw tightened. "Complaint records are confidential." "Actually, according to Section 12 of the bylaws, homeowners have the right to face their accusers in violation proceedings. If there are multiple complaints, those complainants should be here to state their concerns publicly." You could have heard a pin drop. Brenda shuffled papers, her face reddening. Thomas Wright whispered something to her. She shook her head sharply. "The complaints came through proper channels," she said. "We don't need to produce the complainants." A woman in the audience stood up. I recognized her as Helen Martinez, who lived a few houses down from me. "I'd like to say something. I walk past Mr. Vance's house almost every day, and I think it's beautiful. My daughter is studying environmental science, and she's fascinated by his yard. He's been kind enough to give her a tour and explain what he's doing. I haven't heard anyone in this neighborhood complain about his property, not once." Another person stood, a younger man I didn't know. "I'm curious about these complaints too. I've been in this neighborhood for 5 years, and the HOA has never cared about landscaping as long as people mow their lawns. This seems targeted. Brenda banged a gavel on the table. We're not going to debate this further tonight. The board will deliberate and provide Mr. Vance with our decision within 7 business days. I'd also like to note, I said, maintaining my calm tone, that if this violation stands, I plan to appeal to the South Carolina Department of Consumer Affairs. HOAs in this state are required to act reasonably and in good faith. A fine based on vague aesthetic complaints without specific bylaw violations doesn't meet that standard. The meeting broke up with a lot of murmuring. Several residents came up to me afterward to express support. Helen Martinez introduced me to her daughter, a bright college sophomore who asked enthusiastic questions about my Franklinia trees. Marcus and Sarah congratulated me on handling the board well. You made your case clearly, Sarah said. If they uphold this fine after that presentation, it's pure arbitrariness. But as we walked out to the parking lot, I saw Brenda standing by her SUV, talking intensely on her phone. She looked furious. I had a sinking feeling this wasn't over. The next morning, I found another notice on my door. This one cited an entirely new violation: running a commercial business from my home without proper permits. The fine was $500. I stood there in disbelief, reading and rereading the notice. The claim was that because I consulted with Botanical Gardens and received payment for my work, and because I grew plants on my property as part of that work, I was operating a commercial nursery in violation of community and zoning regulations. This was absurd. I did not sell plants to the public. I did not have business hours or customers coming to my home. My consulting work involved site visits to botanical gardens, written reports, and occasionally providing specimens from my personal collection for conservation purposes. It was no different from any other professional who worked from a home office. I called my lawyer immediately. Her name was Andrea Torres, and she had handled my house closing 3 years ago. I explained the situation, and she listened carefully. "This sounds like harassment," Andrea said. "HOAs have authority, but they can't just make up violations. Forward me everything: the original citation, the documentation you presented at the hearing, and this new notice. I'll draft a cease and desist letter." "Will that help?" "It'll put them on notice that you're serious and represented by counsel. Sometimes that's enough to make unreasonable people back down. Sometimes it just escalates things. We'll see." While Andrea worked on the legal response, I decided to do some digging into Brenda's background. I wasn't normally the type to investigate people, but something about this situation felt off. The sudden escalation, the questionable new violation, the refusal to provide details about complaints. It all suggested something personal was driving this beyond simple HOA busybody behavior. I started with basic internet searches. Brenda Whitmore had lived in Charleston for about 20 years. She was active in several community organizations and had been HOA president for 4 years. Her husband worked in commercial real estate. They had 2 adult children who had both moved out of state. Then I found something interesting. 5 years ago, Brenda had been involved in a dispute with a previous neighbor over a property line. The neighbor had planted a row of privacy trees that Brenda claimed encroached on her property. The dispute had escalated to litigation, and according to court records, Brenda had lost. The judge ruled that the survey she provided was incorrect and ordered her to pay the neighbor's legal fees. I wondered if that experience had left her hypersensitive to anything she perceived as non-conforming landscaping. Or maybe she just enjoyed the power that came with being HOA president and didn't like being challenged. Over the next few days, I received incredible support from the neighborhood. Helen Martinez organized a petition in my favor, and 32 residents signed it. Several people posted supportive messages in the neighborhood social media group. A few neighbors even came by to tour my property, curious to learn more about what I was growing. One visitor was particularly interesting. His name was Daniel Kim, and he had recently moved into the neighborhood. He was a journalist for the Charleston Post and Courier and specialized in environmental issues. "This is a great story," Daniel said as I showed him around my greenhouse. Small-scale conservation efforts are exactly the kind of thing we need more of, and the fact that you're being harassed by your HOA for doing important work, that's newsworthy. "I don't know if I want this in the newspaper," I said, hesitating. "I just want to be left alone to do my work." Sometimes publicity is the best defense against petty bureaucrats. People hate HOA overreach stories. If this gets attention, the board will have to back down or look terrible. He had a point, but I wanted to exhaust other options first. Andrea's cease and desist letter went out the next day, formally demanding that the HOA rescind both violations and warning of legal action if they continued their harassment. The board's response came exactly 7 business days after the hearing, as promised. They upheld the original violation, reduced the fine to $100, but added a stipulation that I remove 25% of the plants from my front yard and paint my greenhouse a different color. The commercial business violation was also upheld, with an additional requirement that I cease all professional activities related to botanical consulting from my home. Andrea read the decision over the phone to me, her tone incredulous. "This is one of the most overreaching HOA decisions I've ever seen. They're essentially telling you what percentage of plants you can have and trying to control your profession. We're going to fight this. What are my options? We can request arbitration, which the bylaws provide for. Or we can go straight to court. Given how unreasonable they're being, I'd recommend court. We'll argue that their actions are arbitrary, capricious, and exceed their authority under the bylaws and South Carolina law." "How long will that take?" "Months, probably. In the meantime, don't pay the fines and don't make any changes to your property. Document everything, especially any further harassment." I didn't have to wait long for that. The following week, I received a notice that my trash cans were stored improperly. Then one that my mailbox needed repainting. Then another claiming that my lawn wasn't mowed to the appropriate height, despite the fact that I used a native ground cover in most of my front yard specifically to reduce mowing needs. Each violation came with a $50 fine. It was blatant, systematic harassment. Andrea filed a lawsuit in Charleston County Circuit Court, claiming that the HOA was engaging in discriminatory enforcement of bylaws, exceeding its authority, and causing emotional distress through harassment. We requested an injunction to stop the HOA from issuing further violations while the case proceeded. That's when Daniel Kim's article came out. The headline read, "Charleston Botanical Consultant Fights HOA Over Rare Plant Conservation Effort." The article was detailed and sympathetic, featuring photos of my property and quotes from Marcus and Sarah about the importance of my work. It also mentioned the escalating violations and painted a picture of HOA overreach. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The article was shared thousands of times on social media. My email inbox filled with messages of support from botanists, gardeners, and people who had their own HOA horror stories. Several news outlets picked up the story, and I found myself doing phone interviews with reporters from Atlanta, Charlotte, and even a national gardening magazine. The publicity had an unexpected consequence. I received a call from someone named Richard Hendricks, who introduced himself as a resident of Greenbrier Commons and a recently retired attorney. Mr. Vance, I've been watching this situation with great interest. I've lived in this neighborhood for 10 years, and I've become increasingly concerned about how Brenda Whitmore runs the HOA. I'd like to help. How so? I started reviewing the HOA's records, which are supposed to be available to any homeowner. Brenda has been making it difficult, but I managed to obtain the last 3 years of financial statements. There are some irregularities I think you should know about. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Charleston. Richard was in his late 60s, sharp-eyed and precise in his manner. He spread documents across the table. "Look at these expenditures," he said, pointing to line items. "Landscaping services to Whitmore Garden Design. That's Brenda's daughter's company. Over the past 3 years, the HOA has paid them $78,000. Is that unusual?" It's not illegal for an HOA to hire a board member's relative, but it requires disclosure and typically competitive bidding. I found no records of either. And look at these charges: monthly consultations, seasonal planning fees, emergency services. For a neighborhood with common areas that consist of a clubhouse, a pool, and a few flower beds at the entrance, it's excessive. I studied the numbers. Richard was right. Something smelled fishy. "There's more," he continued. "I talked to some long-time residents. Apparently 3 years ago, before you moved here, there was another homeowner who challenged the HOA. He wanted to install solar panels. Brenda fought him hard, issued violations, made his life miserable. He eventually moved. So this is a pattern. It seems like anyone who challenges her authority or threatens her control becomes a target. And I suspect your situation specifically bothers her because you're getting attention for your landscaping, which might make residents question why we're paying her daughter so much money for such mediocre results." This was a significant development. I called Andrea and told her what Richard had found. She was very interested. If we can show a pattern of retaliation against homeowners who challenge the board and add potential financial conflicts of interest, we've got a much stronger case. "Can Richard testify?" I'll ask him. Richard was more than willing. He had already compiled a detailed analysis of the HOA's finances and was prepared to question the expenditures publicly. The court hearing for our injunction request was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the publicity continued to build. A local news station sent a reporter to interview me at my property. Standing in my front yard, surrounded by flowering natives and rare specimens, I explained my work and the situation with the HOA. "It's not just about me," I told the camera. "It's about whether HOAs can arbitrarily target homeowners for doing legal, beneficial activities. Conservation work is important, especially in an era of climate change and habitat loss. To be punished for trying to preserve endangered species is absurd." The segment aired during the evening news and was subsequently shared widely online. The comments section was overwhelmingly supportive, with many people sharing their own negative HOA experiences. Brenda did not take the attention well. She sent an email to all homeowners claiming that I was bringing unwanted media scrutiny to the neighborhood and damaging property values through negative publicity. This backfired spectacularly when several residents replied, pointing out that the publicity was a result of the HOA's actions, not mine. A group of concerned homeowners, led by Helen Martinez and Richard Hendricks, organized a special meeting to call for a vote of no confidence in the current board. The bylaws allowed for such a vote if 20% of homeowners signed a petition, which they easily achieved. The special meeting was scheduled for the same week as our court hearing. The neighborhood was essentially in open revolt. I spent the days before court preparing my testimony with Andrea. She coached me on how to answer questions clearly and concisely, how to stay calm under pressure, and how to present myself professionally. We reviewed all our evidence, the documents showing my greenhouse approval, the letters from conservation organizations, the petition from neighbors, Richard's financial analysis, and the mounting stack of frivolous violations. The morning of the hearing arrived. I put on a suit and drove to the Charleston County Courthouse downtown. Andrea met me outside along with Marcus and Sarah, who had both agreed to testify. Richard was there too, with his organized binders of HOA financial records. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, paneled in dark wood with fluorescent lights that gave everything a slight greenish tinge. Judge Patricia Morrison presided, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and an air of no-nonsense competence. The HOA was represented by a lawyer named Douglas Preston, a smooth-talking man in an expensive suit who opened by arguing that HOAs needed broad discretion to maintain community standards, and that my case was simply a resident unhappy with legitimate enforcement actions. Andrea countered by walking through the timeline of escalating, questionable violations, and highlighting how the HOA's actions exceeded its authority under both the bylaws and South Carolina law. Your Honor, Andrea said, the evidence will show that the Greenbrier Commons HOA has engaged in targeted harassment of Mr. Vance because he challenged a violation that was improperly issued. The HOA has manufactured violations, refused to follow its own procedures, and failed to act in good faith. I was called to testify first. I explained my background and work, described my property and its conservation purpose, and detailed the sequence of events starting with the first violation notice. Andrea introduced photos and documents systematically, building a clear picture of my professionalism and the frivolous nature of the accusations. Douglas Preston cross-examined me, trying to make my property sound chaotic and my work seem like a commercial operation. Mr. Vance, you admit that you receive payment for consulting with Botanical Gardens. Yes, that's my profession. And you grow plants on your property that you then provide to these gardens. Occasionally, yes, as part of conservation efforts. I don't sell plants commercially. But you do transfer plants from your property and receive payment for your services. How is that not a commercial operation? By that logic, any professional who works from a home office is running a commercial operation. I'm a consultant. I write reports, provide expertise, and occasionally contribute specimens from my personal collection to research institutions. I don't have customers coming to my home. I don't have business signage. I don't sell to the public. Marcus testified next, explaining the conservation significance of my work and the rarity of several species in my collection. He was an excellent witness, clear and authoritative. Sarah followed, providing context about the importance of distributed conservation efforts and how private collectors like myself formed a crucial network for preserving biodiversity. Then Richard took the stand. Andrea walked him through the HOA financial records, establishing the payments to Brenda's daughter's company and the lack of proper disclosure or competitive bidding. Douglas Preston objected repeatedly, arguing that HOA finances weren't relevant to a dispute over landscaping violations. Judge Morrison overruled him. I think it's potentially relevant to establishing bias and motive, counselor. I'll allow it. Richard was devastating in his testimony. He had found even more than he initially told me. Brenda's husband's real estate company had been paid consulting fees for property assessments that had no clear deliverables. Her son had been hired for pool maintenance at rates well above market standard. In my opinion, as a former attorney who has reviewed many HOA financial arrangements, Richard concluded, this represents a significant conflict of interest and potential self-dealing. We broke for lunch, and Andrea was cautiously optimistic. The judge is paying close attention. I think she sees what's happening here. The afternoon session began with Brenda taking the stand. Douglas Preston had her present the HOA's position, that they were simply enforcing community standards and protecting property values. When Andrea cross-examined her, things got interesting. Miss Whitmore, you testified that multiple residents complained about Mr. Vance's property. How many specifically? I don't recall the exact number. More than 5, possibly. More than 3, Brenda hesitated. I'd have to check the records. We've subpoenaed those records, Miss Whitmore. According to the complaint log you provided, exactly 1 resident submitted a complaint about Mr. Vance's property. Who was that resident? Another long pause. I believe it was Thomas Wright, the vice president of the HOA, a member of the board you chair. Yes. So when you told Mr. Vance that multiple neighbors had complained, that was false. I may have been mistaken about the number of formal complaints. Andrea introduced the complaint log into evidence. It showed a single complaint from Thomas Wright, dated 2 days before my first violation notice. The complaint was vague, mentioning only that my property looked overgrown. Miss Whitmore, your daughter owns Whitmore Garden Design, correct? Yes. And the HOA has paid her company $78,000 over the past 3 years. We hired a landscaping service. That's normal. Did you disclose this relationship to the board? They knew. Is there a record of that disclosure in the meeting minutes? Brenda's face reddened. I don't know. I suppose there should be. Did the HOA solicit competitive bids before hiring your daughter's company? We were satisfied with her work. That's not what I asked. Did you solicit competitive bids as required by the bylaws for expenditures over $10,000? I don't recall. Andrea produced the bylaws, highlighted the relevant section, and established that no competitive bidding had occurred. She then moved to the subsequent violations issued to me. Miss Whitmore, after Mr. Vance challenged the initial violation and retained an attorney, he received 7 additional violation notices in a 2-week period. Is that typical? We issue violations when we observe them. In the previous 12 months, how many total violations were issued to all homeowners? I don't have that information with me. I do. Andrea held up another document. According to the records you provided in discovery, the HOA issued a total of 9 violations in the previous year. Then suddenly, Mr. Vance receives 7 violations in 2 weeks. After he challenged the board and hired an attorney, does that seem proportionate to you? He was not in compliance with multiple provisions. His trash cans were stored in his garage as they always had been. His mailbox was in perfect condition. His yard was immaculately maintained. These violations were pretextual, weren't they? You were retaliating against him for challenging your authority. Douglas Preston objected, but the damage was done. Brenda looked flustered and defensive. Judge Morrison called for a short recess. When we returned, she had clearly made up her mind. I've heard enough, she said. This court finds that the Greenbrier Commons HOA has exceeded its authority in issuing violations to Mr. Vance. The initial citation regarding excessive plants was vague and not supported by specific bylaw provisions. The subsequent violations appear retaliatory in nature. The claim that Mr. Vance is operating a commercial business is without merit. The HOA is enjoined from issuing further violations regarding Mr. Vance's landscaping or professional activities unless it can demonstrate a clear, specific bylaw violation. She paused, looking directly at Brenda. "Furthermore, I am concerned about the financial irregularities presented today. While that's not directly before this court, I am ordering the HOA to conduct an independent audit of its finances for the past 5 years and to provide copies to all homeowners." I felt tension drain from my body. Andrea squeezed my arm, smiling. "All existing fines issued to Mr. Vance are vacated," Judge Morrison continued. "The HOA shall pay Mr. Vance's reasonable attorney fees and costs. This hearing is adjourned." Walking out of the courthouse felt surreal. Marcus and Sarah congratulated me. Richard shook my hand vigorously. Andrea was already calculating her fees, which would send a clear message to the HOA about the cost of harassment. But the victory in court was only the beginning. The special meeting to vote on the board was scheduled for that evening. The mood in the neighborhood had shifted dramatically. Between the publicity, the court decision, and the revelation of financial irregularities, Brenda's support had evaporated. I attended the meeting, held once again at the clubhouse. This time the room was packed. Every seat was filled and people stood along the walls. The tension was palpable. Helen Martinez, as the organizer of the petition, chaired the meeting. She explained the procedure. Each board member would have a chance to speak, then the homeowners would vote on whether to remove them from the board. Brenda went first. She tried to defend her actions, claiming she had always acted in the best interests of the community. Her words rang hollow. People had seen the news coverage, read the articles, heard about the court decision. When the vote came, it was overwhelming. Brenda, Thomas Wright, and Jennifer Lawson were removed from the board by margins of more than 70%. Keith Morgan and Patricia Dunn, who had been less involved in the actions against me, survived narrowly. The homeowners then voted to appoint interim board members: Richard Hendricks, Helen Martinez, and a retired accountant named George Patterson. Their first order of business would be to commission the independent audit Judge Morrison had ordered and to review all HOA policies and procedures. After the meeting, dozens of people came up to thank me. Many apologized for not speaking up sooner. Some said they had been afraid of becoming targets themselves. The sense of relief in the community was tangible. Over the next few weeks, things returned to a semblance of normalcy. I went back to my work, consulting with botanical gardens and tending my collection. The rare orchid I had been coaxing to bloom finally opened its delicate pink flowers. My Franklinia trees showed new growth. Life continued. The audit results came out 2 months later. They confirmed what Richard had suspected: inappropriate payments to companies owned by Brenda's family members, lack of competitive bidding, poor financial controls, and some questionable expense reimbursements. The total amount of improper expenditures was estimated at over $100,000. The new HOA board voted to demand repayment. When Brenda refused, they filed a lawsuit. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she and her husband were considering selling their house and leaving Greenbrier Commons. The scandal had made their position untenable. The legal case moved slowly, as these things do. But 8 months after the initial violation notice appeared on my greenhouse door, Brenda Whitmore and her husband quietly settled with the HOA. They agreed to repay $60,000 and to resign permanently from any leadership roles. They sold their house soon after and moved to a different part of Charleston. Thomas Wright and Jennifer Lawson also resigned from the board and maintained low profiles in the neighborhood. No criminal charges were filed. The amounts involved were significant but not enormous, and the HOA wanted to avoid further legal costs for me. The resolution was satisfying but not triumphant. I had never wanted to be in conflict with my HOA. I just wanted to do my work in peace. The whole situation had consumed months of my life, cost me thousands in legal fees, even though I was eventually reimbursed, and created stress I could have done without. But there were positive outcomes too. The new HOA board was professional and reasonable. They revised the bylaws to include clearer landscaping standards, better financial controls, and stronger protections for homeowners facing violations. They also added language explicitly allowing for diverse landscaping approaches, including native plantings, pollinator gardens, and conservation efforts. The publicity brought unexpected opportunities. 2 other botanical gardens reached out to consult with me on conservation projects. A native plant nursery in Colombia wanted to collaborate on propagating rare species. I received speaking invitations from garden clubs and environmental groups. Helen Martinez's daughter, who I had met at that contentious first board meeting, ended up doing an internship with me during her summer break. She was bright and enthusiastic, and I enjoyed sharing my knowledge with someone who genuinely cared about conservation. The neighborhood changed too. Several residents, inspired by my property and the successful challenge to the HOA's overreach, began replacing parts of their traditional lawns with native plantings. Frank Russo next door put in a butterfly garden. A family down the street installed a rain garden to manage stormwater. The neighborhood became more diverse and interesting, better for the local ecosystem. One afternoon, about a year after the whole ordeal began, I was working in my greenhouse when Richard Hendricks stopped by. He had become a friend during the process, and we occasionally had coffee together. "I wanted to thank you," Richard said as we walked through my collection. "Thank me. You're the one who uncovered the financial problems. But you stood up to them first. You didn't back down when it would have been easier to just remove some plants and pay the fine. You made it possible for others to question what was happening." He was right in a way. Sometimes one person refusing to accept injustice creates space for others to act. My botanical training had taught me that ecosystems thrive on diversity, that monocultures are fragile and vulnerable. The same principle applied to communities. A neighborhood where everyone was forced to conform was less resilient than one that allowed for different approaches, different perspectives. "What you're doing here matters," Richard continued, gesturing at the greenhouse. "Not just the conservation work, though that's important, but showing that you can do something different, something meaningful, even in a suburban neighborhood. That's valuable." I thought about that as Richard left and I returned to my work. The Franklinia trees were thriving, their white flowers bright against dark green leaves. These trees, extinct in the wild for 2 centuries, survived because people cared enough to preserve them, to propagate them, to distribute them to gardens and collectors around the world. It was a collaborative effort spanning generations. My small property in Charleston, South Carolina, was one node in that network. The plants growing here were genetic reservoirs, seeds of hope against extinction. When I provided cuttings or seeds to other institutions, I was helping ensure these species would survive whatever challenges the future brought. The HOA had seen my work as excessive, as deviant from their vision of suburban conformity. But from another perspective, it was exactly what suburban properties should be: productive, beneficial, contributing to something larger than individual property values. That evening, I received an email from a botanical garden in Asheville, North Carolina. They had read about my work and were planning a new conservation wing. Would I be interested in consulting on the project? They needed help designing growing facilities for rare southeastern species and building a network of satellite growers. I smiled and typed out a response. Yes, I was very interested. This was the work I loved, the work I was meant to do. A two-bit HOA president trying to feel important by wielding petty authority had nearly derailed it, but ultimately had failed. As spring turned to summer, my property exploded with growth and color. The native azaleas bloomed in shades of pink and orange. The rare orchids showed their intricate flowers. Butterflies and bees filled the air. Neighbors walking past often stopped to admire the display, some asking questions about specific plants. I had become somewhat of a neighborhood resource. People asked advice about their gardens, about what to plant to attract pollinators, about how to reduce water usage. I was happy to help. Knowledge was meant to be shared. The Charleston Botanical Society asked me to lead a workshop on growing native plants in urban environments. 40 people attended, filling a classroom at the Botanical Garden. I talked about my property, about the species I grew, about the importance of biodiversity even in small spaces. The response was enthusiastic. One participant, a middle-aged woman named Susan, approached me afterward. "I live in a neighborhood with an HOA," she said. "I've wanted to do more interesting landscaping, but I've been afraid they'd come after me." "Have you read your bylaws carefully?" I asked. "Not really. Start there. Know exactly what they can and can't regulate. Document everything. And don't be afraid to do what's right just because someone might complain. Most people are more supportive than you'd think." She thanked me and left, looking thoughtful. I wondered if my experience would embolden others to push back against unnecessary restrictions, to create more diverse and ecologically valuable properties. The lawsuit against Brenda and the former board members eventually settled completely. The HOA recovered most of the misappropriated funds, which were used to improve actual community amenities. Resurfacing the pool deck, updating the clubhouse, and creating a small community garden near the entrance. That community garden was Helen Martinez's idea. The new board approved it enthusiastically. Residents could rent small plots to grow vegetables, herbs, or flowers. It became a gathering place, a spot where neighbors interacted and shared knowledge. I donated some native plants for the boarders and helped design a pollinator section. 2 years after that first violation notice, my property was featured in a regional landscaping magazine. The article was titled "Conservation at Home: One Consultant's Mission to Preserve Rare Species." It included beautiful photos of my yard through the seasons and detailed descriptions of some of the rarer specimens I grew. The article mentioned the HOA conflict in passing, noting it as an example of the challenges facing homeowners who want to do more ecologically responsible landscaping. But the focus was on the positive, the importance of the work, the beauty of the plants, the satisfaction of contributing to conservation. I framed a copy of the article and hung it in my greenhouse. It represented the vindication of my approach, the recognition that what I was doing mattered. But more than that, it was a reminder of why I did this work in the first place. Not for recognition or validation, but because these plants needed advocates, because extinction was forever, because someone had to care. My collection continued to grow. I added several new rare species, including a carnivorous plant native to the Carolina bogs that was threatened by habitat loss. I built a small bog garden with carefully controlled water chemistry to support it. The installation required a permit from the new Architectural Review Committee, which approved it without hesitation. The change in the HOA's culture was remarkable. The new board operated transparently, with financial reports posted online and decisions explained clearly. Meetings were productive rather than contentious. The neighborhood felt more like a community and less like a battleground. I ran into Thomas right one day at the grocery store. He avoided eye contact and quickly pushed his cart in another direction. I felt a momentary pang of something, not quite sympathy, but an awareness of how quickly power and status could evaporate. He had gone from vice president of the HOA to a pariah in his own neighborhood. But mostly, I felt gratitude that the ordeal was over. I could focus on my work without looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next violation notice. My property was secure. My reputation was intact. Life was good. One autumn afternoon, I was giving a tour of my greenhouse to a group of botany students from the College of Charleston when my phone rang. It was Sarah Chen, the plant ecologist who had testified on my behalf. "Robert, I have an exciting opportunity for you. We're putting together a grant proposal for a distributed conservation network in the Southeast. We want to coordinate private growers like yourself with institutions to create redundancy for critically endangered species. Would you be interested in being a pilot site?" "Absolutely. Tell me more." We talked for 30 minutes about the project, about funding sources, about the species they wanted to focus on. It was exactly the kind of collaborative work I loved. My property would be one node in a larger network, my specimens part of a coordinated effort to prevent extinctions. After hanging up, I looked around my greenhouse at the plants I had spent years collecting and nurturing. Each one had a story, a chain of care stretching back through time. The Franklinia trees descended from seeds collected in Georgia in the 18th century. The rare orchids propagated from wild specimens before their habitat was destroyed. The native azaleas rescued from development sites. These plants were living history, biological treasures. The fact that I almost lost the ability to care for them because of an HOA power trip seemed absurd in retrospect. But that was the reality of living in modern America, where homeowners associations wielded tremendous power over private property. I thought about how easily things could have gone differently. If I hadn't been able to afford a lawyer, if I hadn't had professional credentials and institutional support, if the community hadn't rallied to my defense, the outcome could have been much worse. That realization motivated me to do more advocacy work. I started writing articles for gardening magazines and websites about HOA issues, about how to navigate restrictions while still doing meaningful landscaping work. I spoke at conferences about the legal aspects of conservation on private property. I became a resource for other people facing similar challenges. The experience had changed me in some fundamental way. I was more willing to speak up, more aware of the importance of community organizing, less naive about how petty tyranny could flourish in seemingly mundane contexts like neighborhood associations. But I also remained fundamentally optimistic. The plants in my care were thriving. The network of people working on conservation was growing. Young people like Helen's daughter were passionate about ecology and environmental protection. The future, while uncertain, held possibility. As winter approached and my property entered dormancy, I reflected on the journey from that first violation notice to where I stood now. It had been stressful, frustrating, and time-consuming, but it had also been clarifying. I knew what mattered to me. I knew who my allies were. I knew that fighting for what was right sometimes required standing firm in the face of unreasonable opposition. The Franklinia trees lost their leaves, branches stark against the gray sky. But their roots were strong, growing deeper into the earth. Come spring, they would bloom again, white flowers opening to the sun. Extinct in the wild but thriving here in my care, connected to a global network of conservation efforts. That was the real story, not the HOA conflict. The conflict was a distraction, an obstacle, but not the point. The point was the work, the plants, the larger purpose of preservation. Everything else was just noise. I walked back to my house as evening fell, lights warm against the darkness. Tomorrow I would water the greenhouse plants, check on the bog garden, respond to emails from Botanical Gardens seeking advice. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would. And my property in Greenbrier Commons, Charleston, South Carolina, remained what it had always been. A small but significant sanctuary for rare and endangered plants. A demonstration that conservation could happen anywhere, even in the most unlikely places. Even in a suburban neighborhood with an HOA that once tried to shut it down. The irony was that the publicity from the conflict had brought far more attention to Greenbrier Commons than Brenda Whitmore ever feared. But instead of negative attention that lowered property values, it was positive attention that made the neighborhood interesting and distinctive. Real estate agents now mentioned the conservation efforts and diverse landscaping as selling points. The neighborhood had become known for being environmentally progressive, for supporting meaningful work. Property values actually went up. I heard through Helen that a family had specifically chosen Greenbrier Commons because they read about the HOA's transformation in the news. They wanted to live somewhere that valued diversity and sustainability over rigid conformity. The market, it turned out, rewarded communities that allowed residents to do interesting things. On a crisp December day, I received a package from the Missouri Botanical Garden. Inside were seeds of a rare fern species they wanted me to attempt propagating. The accompanying letter explained that I had been recommended by Sarah Chen as someone with the expertise and dedication to take on challenging species. I planted the seeds that afternoon in carefully prepared flats, following the specific protocols the Botanical Garden provided. There was no guarantee of success. These things were delicate, temperamental, requiring patience and attention. But that was the nature of conservation work. You tried, you learned, you tried again. Standing in my greenhouse, hands covered in potting soil, surrounded by the quiet presence of rare plants from around the world, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was where I belonged, doing work that mattered, contributing in my small way to the preservation of biological diversity. The HOA drama was behind me now, a story I would occasionally tell when people asked how I ended up with such an unusual property. But it was just that, a story, a chapter in a larger narrative about passion and purpose. As I locked the greenhouse and walked back to the house, I noticed my neighbor Frank outside checking his mailbox. He waved and I waved back. Simple moments like that reminded me that despite the conflict with the HOA, most people in the neighborhood were good, reasonable people. They just needed someone to stand up to the unreasonable ones first. The sun set over Charleston, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. My property, with its diverse collection of plants, its greenhouse and bog garden, its carefully curated ecosystem, stood as a quiet testament to what was possible when someone refused to accept arbitrary limitations. And somewhere, in botanical gardens and private collections around the world, other growers were doing similar work. We were a network, connected by shared purpose, preserving species that might otherwise vanish forever. The HOA had tried to stop me, but they never really understood what they were fighting against. You cannot fine away dedication. You cannot regulate away purpose. And you certainly cannot intimidate someone who knows their work matters more than your petty rules. That ultimately was the lesson of my experience. Know what matters, stand firm, and trust that reason and justice will eventually prevail. It may take time, effort, and support from others, but it is worth fighting for. My name is Robert Vance, and I am a botanical garden consultant who grows rare species in a suburban neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina. My HOA tried to fine me into submission, but instead they got educated about the importance of conservation and the limits of their authority. And my plants, they continue to thrive, growing stronger with each passing season, proof that life finds a way even in the face of opposition, just as it always has, just as it always will.